All right, today I'm joined by Rob Morris. Rob is a teacher, a history teacher in Idaho, and he's also an author that has written multiple books. One of my favorite books from Rob is titled The Wild Blue Yonder and Beyond, which is a history of the 95th Bomb Group. Another book that Rob co-wrote is called Prisoner of the Swiss. And Rob, it's really an honor for you to be here with us today.
Thank you.
Before we get started, Rob, I've known you for several years, but only through social media. I must say that I know exactly the kind of teacher you are. You inspire your students. It's obvious by things I see on social media. You dig into history. You make it come alive for them. I had a teacher in high school just like that, and I remember him well to this day. And I want to thank you for that. Also, all your books share shelf space in my library with guys like David McCullough and Stephen Ambrose. Your books are some of my favorites. I want to thank you for all that work. And I'm just so honored that you'd spend time with me today to talk about the two topics I want to discuss with you are the B-17 and also the Swiss internment camps. Those are two things that you've written about, and I want to pick your brain on those items today.
Okay.
I want to start off by talking about the B-17. I want to read a couple of quotes. The first from Colonel Robert Morgan, who flew the Memphis Belle, probably the most famous B-17 there was. He called the B-17 a Stradivarius of an airplane. Another B-17 pilot from the 8th Air Force, Wally Hoffman, he said the plane can be cut and slashed almost to pieces by enemy fire and bring its crew back home. So Rob, let's talk about the B-17. Can you kind of walk us through what life would have been like inside a B-17 on a bombing mission? I know we've seen the videos, I'm sure, of like the flak exploding around the airplanes. What would that be like being inside that airplane?
Okay. Well, I've only been in one on the ground, but it looks like a very big airplane when you look at it on TV or in a movie or whatever. But when you actually get inside it, it's very tight inside, and the spaces are very cramped, and it would be even more so because the guys that were flying it were bulked up with all kinds of cold weather gear and oxygen and all that. So first of all, is you're at about 30,000 feet. It's around 60 degrees below zero, so it's extremely cold up there. And the plane is not pressurized, so there's no oxygen. You have to be constantly on oxygen at altitude, or you're going to die fairly quickly of hypoxia. So you got that aspect, and then you throw into that the fact that these guys are fighting off enemy fighters, especially in 1943 and early 1944, and also hoping that these big puffs of flak don't blow up right next to them and throw shrapnel all through their aircraft, which was very scary too. And as the German fighter presence began to decline and our fighter escort became better, the main danger started to be the flak, and the flak was really scary to the guys because it would puff all around you, and you knew that all it took was one in just the right place and you were gone. So flak would be really scary. At least you can fight back against a fighter, but it would be super cold. You'd have to worry about your oxygen malfunctioning, and you would have, the skin of the airplane was very, very thin. So things would go right through the skin of the aircraft. The flak would go right through the skin. Actually, I have a piece of flak that one co-pilot gave me years ago that after a mission, he noticed there was a hole in his parachute, and he dug out a piece of flak, and it looks like a piece of metal that you'd find on an engine block or something. It's just very, very heavy metal shrapnel, and I've heard of men somebody else on their crew just fell down, and they looked them over and they couldn't find out what was wrong with them, and they get back to base, and the doctor would look them over, and finally they'd find maybe just a tiny little sliver sticking into their brain from flak. So it didn't take very much to kill you.
Would you say that the B-17 was? Do you think we could have won the European war without the B-17? In your opinion?
I don't think so. I think that the B-17 was an integral part of winning the war in Europe, um, for a lot of reasons. One of the reasons being that they did knock out a lot of the industrial capacity, especially after they were able to fly the deeper missions. Um, and I would say they're super important. I always wondered, um, the B-29. They never really used the B-29 in the European theater. In fact, I don't think they ever did. That was flown strictly in Japan, but the B-29 was such a superior aircraft as far as technology. It was pressurized and had the remote firing turrets and gun turrets and things like that. But the B-17 was really a plane from the 1930s, early 30s, mid 30s, and the fact that it was still used right up till the end of World War II, even though you had these other technically advanced aircraft, is pretty amazing. So I really don't think so. I think a lot of historians have made the argument that the B-17 was integral to winning the war.
One of the things I really appreciate about your book, The Wild Blue Yonder and Beyond, was the personal stories of the B-17 bomber crews and what many of them went through, and also how many B-17s were lost. You go into a lot of detail about how they were lost, and simple things like them taking off in foggy conditions and having a way to fly through the fog to get up to altitude, and the planes would crash into each other when they were doing that. Things that in today's world wouldn't be an issue because of the technology we have today, but just simple things like that. We lost so many men.
I think that a lot of the guys that I talked to said that was one of the scariest parts of a mission later in the war, because they were mounting missions with thousand or more bombers, and all the bases were within about, I don't know, I'd say 50 miles, something like that. And these planes were all circling in sometimes in completely stocked in conditions, and they had this set altitudes they were supposed to go up at, and make sure that they took off a few minutes after the plane in front of them, and getting up to altitude where they did their final assembly. A lot of those planes ran into each other, just terrifying, and the pilots just sweated the whole time. They were super stressed out when they were doing that, and I can imagine. I flew a little plane, and I was just a visual flight rule, but my instructor one time, he showed me how you can land in zero visibility, and it was really scary because we couldn't see anything almost until we touched the runway. And I can't imagine having hundreds of planes within a few miles of you all circling and not having any of the equipment to even know where anybody else was.
Well, let's go into the Swiss internment camps. The reason that I even learned about Swiss internment camps, I never knew they existed until I was able to meet Ronald Grove, who you do talk about in your book, The Wild Blue Yonder and Beyond. But you actually wrote a book. You co-wrote a book with, I believe his name is Dan Cullen, and it's called Prisoner of the Swiss.
You want some background on that whole how that came about?
Absolutely.
Okay, so So I read a book by Dan Culler, and this was probably 20 some years ago, and it was a very small printing. He had printed these himself, and he stored them in his spare bedroom or whatever. He lived in Arizona, and so hardly anyone ever read this book. And I got in touch with him because I thought it was really interesting. But Dan had written this book called the Black Hole of Wildlermoos, which was a Swiss federal prison, uh, where most of the prisoners there were actually Swiss. It was where murderers and rapists and people like that were, but they also threw some Americans in there. And so Dan ended up, because he tried to escape, he ended up um, in this terrible prison, and terrible things happened in this prison. He was raped in prison. He was beaten up. Uh, uh, he caught tuberculosis while he was in the prison. He almost died from that. The commandant of the prison was a Swiss Nazi. Uh, anyway, so I was super interested in that story, and so when I wrote my first book, which was Untold Valor, uh, I have a whole chapter on Dan Culler, and I kind of took his story and told it in a chapter, and then we became very good friends, and we emailed almost every day. There was Dan and another veteran and a younger guy like me that just liked history, and me, and we'd email almost every day until the two older guys died. But um, anyway, a few years later, he was still alive. This was probably maybe 8 years ago or so. I said, how about uh, I take your book and I kind of edit it and shorten it up and rewrite it a little bit, and we tried to get it published again because it had never been published except by him. So he said, "Yeah, let's do that." So uh, basically, I took the book. I think the the edition that I did was about half as long as his, and I also got a guy named uh, Dwight Mears, who is a professor at West Point, and he's like the expert uh, on the Swiss internment. He's the guy that got the Wildlermoos prisoners the prisoner of war medal. So he's a really interesting guy, and he wrote a couple chapters in the book about using his expertise about how he went about getting this uh, prisoner of war medal. I think it was his uncle that was at Wildlermoos, and they didn't get these medals until they didn't start getting them until maybe 10, 15 years ago, something like that. Maybe it was even more recently. So anyway, he wrote a couple chapters, and I wrote the rest. And then Dan read it, and he said, "Hey, this is really good. Okay, let's do it." So uh, it was published by Casemate, and it's been selling steadily, I think, ever since. It's not Harry Potter or anything, but for the genre, it does pretty well, and it's got a lot of good reviews and things like that. So that's kind of the story about behind how I ended up writing that book. It's actually kind of a team effort between Dan Culler and me, and also Dwight Mears.
Well, his story needs to be told for sure, and I'm glad that you took it upon yourself to get that book published. It was very eye opening for me when I read it.
It's a scary
Go ahead.
it's a scary book. I think that Dan Culler, for the entire rest of his life, he had serious mental issues and psychological issues from from what he had to go through in that prison, and um, he was he's a very strong person, even to be able to get on with his life, and he had a wife and kids and everything, but he was a very damaged guy.
I don't know how anyone could live through that and not be.
Yeah.
What can you walk us through a typical day in a Swiss internment camp?
Yeah, it's actually a really interesting story. I didn't know anything about it either until I read Dan's book. Uh, the Americans and other Allied um, airmen that ended up interned in Switzerland, they they were most of them were ended up in Switzerland because their planes had mechanical issues, or they'd been shot up really badly, and they couldn't make it back to base, and they didn't want to crash in Germany. Uh, and and sometimes they would just stray into Swiss airspace. So anyway, they would fly into Switzerland, over Switzerland, and the Swiss had a air force, and they had German planes, but they had Swiss markings on them, and the Swiss planes would come up beside the B-17s, and they would escort them uh, to the land. There, they had a specific field where all of the Allied planes would land, and the fighters would escort them down, and they'd land at this specific base, and then the Swiss would keep the planes. The planes were interned too, and then the guys, after they were processed, they were sent to these ski resorts, basically up in the Swiss Alps. So these were like kind of like luxury hotels up in the Swiss Alps, but they were very isolated. You know, there might only be one little narrow highway going in and out of them, or maybe a train or something. But most of them, there was only one way to get out of the resort, and it was on a road that the Swiss could make sure nobody tried to go down, and so they basically lived in these stripped down luxury hotels, but they weren't very luxurious for the Americans. Um, a lot of times they didn't have heat, or the water would freeze in the winter and things like that. But as long as you didn't try to escape, it actually wasn't too bad. You got paid every month. The Red Cross checked up on you. You could go skiing. You could hang out in the town. You get passed to go to the town, the resort town, and really wasn't bad at all, unless you tried to escape. And that because they were told, do not try to escape from the internment camps. Even the American attaché in Bern said, don't try to escape. But some of the guys, because of their indoctrination when they went into the Air Corps, they had been taught, if you are a prisoner, you should try to escape. So the ones that actually tried to escape, many of them, if they were caught, then they were sent to this Swiss federal prison called Willermoos, and these guys were this prison was as bad as any concentration camp where the Jews were sent in Germany. Uh, the conditions were horrible. They were mixed in with all of these violent criminals who, were rapists and murderers and things like that. And the commander of the prison, instead of spending money on things like food and different things to make the lives of the prisoners better, was embezzling all the money for his own lifestyle and his mistress and all that. So he was basically a war criminal and a Nazi sympathizer. So if you tried to escape, you ended up in Willermus, and that was terrible. But if you were just in one of these resorts, it really wasn't that bad. And I just remembered the airport where the all the planes went down was called Dubendorf, and one of the little resort cities was called Adelboden, and there are several more, but my brain is starting to not remember little things like names of cities anymore. But there were two or three other cities other than Adelboden. I think one might have been Wengen. Uh, and anyway, so I think total there were about 2,000, over 2,000 internees. Most of them did not try to escape. Some of them did successfully escape, like Ronald Grove. Some of them uh, tried multiple escapes, and Dan Koller did eventually escape. He did get out of Switzerland. And it's a very exciting story how he escaped too. But um, the guys that didn't try to escape, they have fairly good memories of internment. The guys that end up in Wilhelmus, it was just like being in Auschwitz or something, except that they didn't exterminate them. The Swiss supposedly were neutral, but almost all of the German aviators that were interned in Switzerland were repatriated to Germany, and the Swiss treated the Allied airmen differently than they did the German airmen, which I thought was kind of interesting, because you think if a country is neutral, that it's going to treat everybody the same, but it didn't do that.
Yeah, and I think that was the surprise to me when you think of a neutral country. Um, I somewhere I read, and I don't remember where I picked this up, but someone was talking about the Swiss internment camps, that if the Swiss thought the Americans were winning the war, they would treat the Americans a little bit better. If they thought the Germans were winning the war, they would treat them a little bit worse. Did the U.S. know about those internment camps in Switzerland? Were they actively trying to get those guys freed, or what was that? Do you know anything about that?
I do. The U.S. government knew about the Swiss internment camps. There was a military attaché in Bern. His name was Barnwell Legge, Legge, and I haven't heard too many kind comments about him from the interns. Uh, but I've also heard from other historians, and possibly Dwight Mears is one of them, that he did do things behind the scenes that the airmen wouldn't have known about. But so who knows? Who knows the truth about that? But yeah, the Americans did. And the other thing that's really interesting about that is, in Dan Koller's case, and I think all of them, when Dan Koller came back from Switzerland, well, before he even made it back to the States, they interrogated him, and they told him there was no Wilderness. It didn't exist. Uh, they disbelieved everything he said, and they said, if you tell anybody about this, uh, nobody's going to believe you. They wouldn't give him any real psychiatric help for this. The government just completely denied that this Wildermus existed. Now, they knew all about the camps up in the mountains, and I think the guys that were in those camps were treated fairly well, but they completely disavowed the existence of Wildermus, said it never existed, and it wasn't for many years that we found out that this place really did exist. And I think now it's the grounds where this camp was, because it was demolished, is a psychiatric hospital.
One of the things that I'm trying to do with this Veterans Day story is to put a face on these men that served in World War II. I think we're so far removed from it now. Many of us just think about it as something that happened, and we don't put a face on it. And
Yeah.
the fact that I got to spend some time with Ronald Grove before he died, And the thing that really brought that to life for me, one of the things, along with spending time with Ronald Grove, was reading your history, the book you wrote about the 95th Bomb Group. And I want to thank you for bringing all those stories to life. It's amazing to read that book and all those stories actually come to life. And the way you wrote those stories it just really was great. And all your other books too. Can you kind of give me your 60-second elevator speech about these men that served?
Just 60 seconds, it'd be tough. uh, you know that we always say that they were the greatest generation, and it's kind of trite to say that. And the thing that always interested me, because I've talked to hundreds of World War II veterans, and I always say, well, do you think if the same thing happened today, that the kids today, 18, 19, 20, could do the same thing that you guys did? And you know what 100% of them have said to me? They have said yes, they could. They said, and I think it's true. Some people say people are born great, but really it's the conditions you're put in that bring out greatness. And these are just normal guys. I mean, they were 18, 19, 20, and they stepped up to do something that had to be done, and they did it. And then when they were old men, which is when I knew them, in their 80s, they're like, hey, we just did what needed to be done. We're no different than anybody else. That's how they see it. But they did do some pretty amazing things, for sure. They literally saved the world from people like Adolf Hitler and the Japanese. And and it was the greatest war in the history of the world. And we got to know some of the guys that fought in it. I mean, how lucky is that?
Well, I want to thank you for your time today, Rob. I'm going to make sure we post a link to your Amazon author website. The two books that I want to really talk about, that we've talked about today, once again, The Wild Blue Yonder and Beyond, which is a history of the 95th Bomb Group, and the book you co-wrote with Dan Kohler called The Prisoner of the Swiss. I recommend that everybody read these books. The history that you talk about there are things that we cannot forget. And I just want to thank you for your time today.
You're very welcome. Thanks for inviting me to talk.